Okay, welcome back. It is 4/25 of 2015. We're going to look at the third lesson on personhood from Ricoeur, and it's going to get into the speech act and really give us a lot of information at an early stage in the book, but it kind of gives us a very quick outline of the way that he evaluates the dialogue threshold, how that works, and what's involved as the dialogue threshold. So we're moving out of that first moment of ascription, and we're getting into speech act and the greater depth of what can actually happen at the dialogue threshold. So we're getting into a lot more importance and depth of meaning. And again, it's developed as a triad, and we're going to go through locutionary diversity, illocutionary theme, and perlocutionary dramatic character and effect. That's a fairly new language to me. I haven't really run into perlocutionary before, but those are the three moments. Now, locutionary diversity, initially at the dialogue threshold, interlocution is not to the point where individuals are trying to develop a narrative yet. The narrative program has not yet emerged, and so really that initial stage, as we discussed in the last lesson, is more about acquiring predicates and working on referential data to apply to abstract notions of signs. It's more or less it's a gathering of diverse attributes, and then finding a common focus and assigning attributes to abstract sign as a lexical network. And so it is very much the phase of ascription. That's the first moment. But then we're going to move on to illocutionary work, and that will involve speech and the speech act between two subjects. And so that's going to emerge into actually having the empowerment of a theme to more or less define the context of the dialogue at the dialogue threshold. Now, in the second moment, there's the introduction of two additional features to the exchange at the dialogue threshold. The first is the phonetic stance of the individual. That's your intentionality of meaning that you carry to the threshold before the first word is even spoken. You already have a motivational base stored in your psyche that represents your intentionality and your conviction base and the way you kind of filter historical data. So you come to the threshold with a phonetic stance. And also, Ricoeur says there's the aspect of ousia essence, because each subject takes up positing from the perspective that their version of the essence of the theme is that which should supply and define universality. So it's an attitude of I'm positing, I'm proposing this aspect of essence for this sign. So those two components are added to the work of ascription to move it out of ascription and into illocutionary force. So we're looking at intentionality. This exchange of diversity transitions to exchange of intentionalities, and within the circularity of these dialogical exchanges of intention, we come up against the modality of reflexive utterance, which means that when we posit, we automatically will anticipate and expect a return mirrored within the same theme. Our posited statement is reflexive in its own essence, so it automatically triggers a thematic response. And Ricoeur says that there's an implied otherness between the two subjects that even though they do proclaim to offer a positing of essence, that there's actually something that transcends both individuals at the dialogue threshold as an implied otherness. Now, Ricoeur says in the second moment that statements that we posit in dialogue are statements of extension. And so remember, he is always involved at every moment in deep linguistic analysis. That's just his approach to whatever subject he takes on. It's always linguistic analysis. And so these are statements of extension that we posit as positings of intentionality. Intentionality works toward extension. Now, this positing will abbreviate the ousia subjectivity that the subject carries, coupled with that phronetic stance of intentionality, and that will make those statements the type that want to extend their influence throughout finitude and the historical reality within finitude. Now, these statements of extension are constructions. They are constructions. And so Ricoeur wants to tell us a little bit about that. He gives us 4 aspects of how these posited extension type statements are constructed. And basically, they do have a prefix. There's an intentional prefix to every posited statement. It's either concretely expressed or it's at least implied. And the example would be like, I assert this concerning a sign. I assert this truth concerning the sign that we are discussing. Second point is that these statements are anchored, and he calls this shifting pronouns or shifting adverbs. There's shifting linguistic markers that create different versions of anchoring. If the I pronoun is used, then it's an anchoring of the proposed sign to the one who designates, to the subject at the threshold. But if it's a this, a here, or a now, then the posited sign and its content is anchored in the path of reference. It deals more with the realm of positing, what that encloses. So it's more of a syntactical type positing. It will include voice, and as illocutionary type statements, voice is always first person or second person, which differs from ascription because ascription is always third person. Trying to assign predicates to it, or trying to assign predicates to that thing, that entity. But illocutionary statements of positing are the type that I assert this, or I promise this, or I declare this. They have a power in themselves, and it's always a first or second person for voice. And then the fourth attribute of the construction is the reflexivity that we talked about. They are reflexive in force and fact. The intentional interlocution becomes a historical act. And so, how does it become historical? How can we count it as something that is actually historical? And Ricoeur says, well, it possesses that illocutionary force to create an action simply in speaking. That's what illocutionary force is, that the simple act of speaking causes action. That's illocutionary force. So these intentionality statements of extension do produce illocutionary force. In the here, they do reflect back on themselves in a mirrored fact concerning the sign, which is nested within it. Therefore, this positing is kind of a positing of a fact event. And the mirrored fact concerning the hermeneutic that Ricoeur is discussing is equal to the idea of a posited sign as a thing or as a name. So we're involved in positing facts concerning signs, or a trajectory that references a particular sign. And so Ricoeur says that the utterance, as an utterance of extension, becomes an opacity, which means that it begins to be filled with content, and it becomes a fact event of a sign for our understanding of the category of humanity and personhood. So therefore, the reflexive utterance is always a positing of being. It always posits existential being if we take up those aspects. And that's when we can say that the statement is not transparent. It does have an opaque quality to it of potential content. So this moment gets closed out with Ricoeur asking how do these statements of extension actually become equated with a positing of being. And we begin with a referent. We take up one of the abstract referents of ascription, first elementary level of work at the dialogue threshold, and then we add to that sense, the directional sense of the referent is posited along with it, as the way that we currently understand it as existing in the subjective essence of ourselves as agent. We have our own configuration of the directional sense for the sign we are positing. And then there's the aspect of phronesis. That's equated with the unique center of perspective. Remember, you've got that motivational base that is stored in your long-term memory, and that becomes a unique center of perspective that you always carry to the dialogue threshold, especially when you're getting involved with intentionality. You're certainly going to be relying on that motivational base of convictions. And then there's the final aspect of fixation. The referent, the sense, and the phronetic stance all combine to create a thematic fixation which encloses the fact of our statements of extension within the thematic fixation which encloses it. So we actually do produce an existential theme of personhood, an existential theme of how we want to direct and gather in the other subject that we face at the dialogue threshold. What's the trajectory that we want to take up? So we've certainly moved out of locutionary diversity, and now we're into a thematic kind of atmosphere at the dialogue threshold because we are dealing very concretely with intentionality. And then Ricoeur introduces a word I've never even heard of before, but Perlocutionary dramatic effect for the third moment. And I guess the best way to describe Perlocutionary is that it is the psychological effect of what happens to an individual when they hear the illocutionary statement being spoken and posited at the dialogue threshold. The recipient, the receiving subject, the receiving agent, is triggered toward action. Well, that consequence is called a perlocutionary consequence of effect. And it creates a certain type of character in those who hear it, and it creates a character who will move toward action. So the diversity of abstract signs and the syntax of that thematic fixation in the second moment combine together to take selfhood to the next emerging depth of understanding. And we want to transcend that phonetic stance of very specific, finite context in the second moment. And Ricoeur says at this point, you should understand that we have passed through referential inquiry of ascription, reflexive inquiry of extension, and now the epistemological thrust is going to move us beyond those 2 points and join that posited third consciousness of the virtual subject of universality. We're going to move into the realm of universality. In the first moment, we were dealing with what? Generalization. And then the second moment dealt with historical context and partitioning and illocutionary force. And now the third moment is going to be that actual positing of the virtual subject of a third character at the dialogue threshold that will enclose a workspace of universality for the dialogue taking place. So it will function as a workspace where we will partition away that which is unveiled concerning value within the dialogue. And we'll be able to start moving toward an ideation of the notion of the true concerning selfhood, having already dealt with ascription and already dealt with extension. Now we move on to ideation and notion of selfhood. And it's important to do this because Ricoeur says we have to rescue the signs of representation in the second moment because they have a tendency to fade away. They don't have permanence. They have to be sustained, and they can't remain as things. It's not their nature to remain as a thing. So the opacity of the reflection in the posited statement of extension does move on to a sort of a virtual universal subject and the workspace that corresponds to that, which we can just label as kind of an intersubjective consciousness. So now we're dealing with looking at that reflexive performative extension in the second moment and moving on to how does that become an extension that creates an action, where it's saying, the saying in the second moment creates a doing in the third moment, creating what has been said. And Ricoeur says language is certainly included in the plane of action or the philosophy of action, and within the realm of historical positing, language has a very prominent place. So Ricoeur says we have passed through three different kinds of acts. We have passed through the locutionary act of ascribing predicates. We have passed through the illocutionary act of a fixated thematic force as a kind of a intentional directional force of what we're trying to emerge with at the dialogue threshold. And now we're dealing with how do those spoken statements of extension, how do they create action? How do they become perlocutionary action as we are existentially motivated and existentially disturbed and existentially interrogated toward action? So in just a few brief pages, this is just page 50, but look what we've got here. We got that foundational talk, showed us the three foundational layers of abstraction, historical partition, and ontological structuring. And then in our second lesson, we talked about that first realm of abstraction. What does that really look like? And we got to look at that recurring stored space of our motivational base. And we got to look at referential type work of ascription. But look at this. Now we're looking at that second moment of what happens in the historical realm, where we start getting into some partitioning as prep work for reaching universality. We're going to refine our signs a little bit now in a dialogical way at the dialogue threshold, and eventually that's going to lead us to the perlocutionary dramatic effect, where we become a character in a narrative. But what kind of a narrative are we trying to write? Well, we're trying to write a narrative that surpasses my subjectivity and a narrative that surpasses your subjectivity, and we want it to instead to be the narrative that we construct in that virtual subject area of consciousness, which is speaking